Well, in terms of responding to the far right, I mean, there are obviously lots of different levels that, that a response is needed. Obviously, when we're talking about authoritarian personalities or authoritarian parties in democratic states that are attempting to deconstruct the guardrails of democracy, it's incumbent upon us as citizens in a democracy to strengthen those democratic guardrails. The court system, media, in the case of the United States, Congress and congressional limits on executive power. It's also incumbent upon us to strengthen civil society organizations that are fighting for democratic ideals, whether we're talking about transparency, anti-corruption, human rights, rights of endangered groups, et cetera. So, that's largely taking place within the boundaries of a given state. So it's incumbent upon us in the United States, in my opinion, to fight back against Donald Trump. It is something, a similar mission is presented to the people of Brazil who are upset with Bolsonaro, the people of India who are upset with Modi. Obviously, in some countries, it's more difficult than others. We're talking about in the Philippines, for instance, where Duterte has a popularity rating that hovers around 80%. That's considerably different kind of political struggle than here in the United States, where Donald Trump's popularity rating is around, well, it also varies, but somewhere between 35% and 40%. So that's the challenge within a given country. Transnationally, I think it is important to reconstruct a transnational progressive movement. We really haven't had much of a transnational progressive movement for a long time. Obviously, there was the Communist International, which identified itself at least as progressive, and for a variety of reasons doesn't exist any longer, or doesn't exist in any major way. There was, of course, the World Social Forum, which emerged in the late 1990s as a response to perceived victory or triumph of neoliberalism, the notion that there was really no alternative to a particular kind of capitalism. And that enjoyed a tremendous amount of support for a period of time, but in part because it decided to avoid becoming explicitly political, has eventually gradually lost its influence. I think that there's a vacuum at the international level for that kind of activism, and something that I think people really are looking for at this point. I mean, we're talking about a variety of significant threats, not just the threat of the far right. I mean, that's kind of a symptom rather than an underlying cause. The underlying causes for our things we should be worried about, global warming, enormous economic inequality, potential pandemics, the movement of migrants and refugees around the world in huge numbers that neither international mechanisms nor national mechanisms seem to be able to deal with. These are major issues, and they have to be dealt with at an international level because they are transnational in nature. And yet we don't have either the institutions or really mechanisms by which individuals can get involved in addressing these problems. So I think that's the problem that faces us. Now, in terms of what any individual can do, I would say, let me give you two examples. One example for kind of addressing the far right. I think a lot of people are concerned about how the far right appears in their main street, in their town, whether it's a presentation that is at the local university, or it's a march through town by alt-right or even neo-Nazis. How to address that as an individual, and especially when you see these kind of very aggressive marchers. I think one One response, obviously, is to go out with a sign and stand there and register your protest. Say, no hate in our town. And that's can be a very effective approach. But I would suggest that there are perhaps more creative ways of challenging the far right. And I'll give an example from Germany, where the far right was marching in a particular town. And the organizers of the counter demonstration basically set up a walkathon, and they solicited pledges from people who were concerned about what was going on in that town. And they lined up alongside this march, and with placards that said, "You," addressed to the far-right marchers, "you have just raised $10,000 for a diversity center." In other words, the walkathon was the amount of territory covered by these demonstrators. So the demonstrators, the far-right demonstrators, had to think to themselves, well, gosh, should I stop? Because if I continue walking, I'm continuing to raise money for these causes that I disagree with. So it put the far right into this quandary by basically flipping the script of what their march was about, which was to be visible and to march through town. And it turns out that in fact they were producing a kind of counterproductive result in that march. I think that's a brilliant kind of way of addressing the far right. So that's one example at a very local level. I mentioned the concerns about climate change. And of course, at an individual level, we all have our choices about how we consume things. Whether we drive a car or ride a bike or use plastic or use a straw. And again, that's absolutely important in terms of how individuals make choices in our society. And all of us have to, have an impact that way. But in terms of the scale of the problem and the urgency of the problem, I think, the groups, the parties, the individuals that have promoted a Green New Deal have really identified perhaps the most potent way of addressing this problem. It's potent for a number of reasons. One, it's a large-scale way of addressing this large-scale problem. Two, it addresses something that the right wing lacks. If you look around the world, the far right, basically has no response to climate change. It's either denying that climate change exists, or it's simply addressing the symptoms of climate change by saying, well, we need larger walls to keep out climate refugees that'll be coming towards our country in greater numbers as the temperatures rise. Progressives have this fantastic strategic opportunity to say, well, this is where we can reach out to voters who are concerned about this urgent issue. Plus, we're not just saying, we're going to throw money at the problem by building walls or, trying to lower the global temperatures through some scientific method, but we're actually going to create jobs by transforming infrastructure. We're going to transform buildings by retrofitting them to make them more energy efficient. We're going to beef up energy sustainable transportation. We are going to transform the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. All of this makes jobs. And that is a major economic concern for people who have voted for far-right leaders. It's not that they were unemployed or that they were at lower tier. I mean, many people who vote for the far right are often in economically comfortable positions. But what they share is a certain anxiety about the future and anxiety about their own status in the future. And if they're given a kind of alternative that says, well, this is a sensible and productive way of dealing with this problem that reduces your anxiety, I think that's an electoral winner. At a local level, I think there has to be a component where people come together at a civic level and say, well, what would we do here in our town, in Skokie or in Boulder, Colorado? What would we do to fit into this larger Green New Deal? Which buildings need to be retrofitted? How can we improve our public transportation? What about our manufacturing and agriculture? Where can we create jobs here locally that would contribute to this larger transformation of the United States? Well, I think the first thing is you want to get involved in an issue you feel passionately about. I mean, if you only feel an abstract connection to an issue, it's going to be tough to maintain your involvement and to push yourself to do things outside your comfort zone. So it has to be something you feel very passionately about. The second is, it's hard to do things by yourself. I mean, you can sit in front of a computer, you can, join a demonstration by yourself. But, ultimately that can make you feel even more alienated rather than less alienated. I really recommend, finding what we would call an affinity group, a group of people that, you feel comfortable with. It doesn't have to be large. It can just be two other people. But it provides a kind of connection between you as an individual and these larger kind of social, challenges that we all face. That, I think, helps ultimately psychologically as well. And it really has to be an affinity group that you meet face to face. I mean, it's nice to be connected to people through the internet who share your ideas and so forth. But the face-to-face connection, the ability to strategize together, that really is indispensable. And yeah, you can subsequently connect to people with larger groups of folks through the internet, but I think having that face-to-face physical meeting is really required to overcome the psychological challenges or barriers to activism.